Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Well, welcome to the Means of Grace podcast. I'm Reverend Rob Hutchinson, the Director of Church Development for the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. And I'm joined today by our resident bishop, Dr. Ken Carter. Welcome, Bishop.
Thank you, Rob. That's great to be here.
Well, it's an interesting time to be a United Methodist. And personally, I think it's an exciting time and one of great opportunity as we get to be a part of following the Spirit's lead to discern what's next for the United Methodist Church. So today I'm looking forward to talking with you about some of the foundational framework we need to be paying attention to as we move through this liminal time of forming and reforming. So to begin with that, you've consistently been inviting us as a conference to consider what it means for congregations to be healthy and vital in their communities. And as I interact with lay and clergy all over the conference, I continue to have people ask me over and over again, what does it mean to be vital and healthy? So we'd love to hear what you think about that.
Well, thank you, Rob, for the conversation, and thanks to you who are listening to Means of Grace, and I'm grateful for this ongoing means of communication. I'll begin by saying that years ago, the Towers-Watson research taught us that most congregations are not healthy.
Right.
And then, years later, since then, this conference went through the Clergy Health Initiative. And they learned that many clergy are not healthy.
Right.
And so there is this relationship of unhealthy churches and unhealthy leaders, clergy and laity leaders. And so you asked me a different question. What is a healthy congregation? We need more healthy congregations and more healthy clergy. And that's not an ought thing, a judgmental thing. Sure. I have access to health care. My physician may sit down with me, happens to be a woman physician, and she may say to me, you need to do a little more of this. You need to do a little less of this. So that's what I think about. So to me, healthy congregations, United Methodist, are comfortable in their identity that Jesus Christ is the center of everything. Right. That's the cross. And then the flame, to me, has always been the warm heart, a loving spirit. And the thing about a flame is that it can't be contained, that the flame goes beyond us. A healthy congregation is externally focused. So they are interested in the elementary school near them, the prison near them. Right. And, I was a pastor in this conference for 28 years, and I knew churches that have been very engaged in loving their communities because they love Jesus Christ, because they know he first loved them. So that's where I would begin, healthy, vital, United Methodist presence. The unhealthy patterns, and when we've been through a lot of them, have been when we've had deep division.
Right.
We've had misinformation about what our identity is, about Christ being the center of things. We've had kind of secret meetings in some places. And so all of that has built mistrust and it's been unhealthy. And so I say this to say we need to move toward that. The other piece is we just came through a global pandemic. There was a lot of loss of life, a lot of challenges to health, and we're reforming, as you say. We're moving back toward health, and so those are some of the ways I think about that.
Yeah. I think as I interact with folks, around our conference and occasionally around the country too, for that vital piece for me, it's that movement that you're talking about, that there is an energy that's there that's palpable. I mean, we can feel it and we see it come to life as congregations are willing to engage out into their community, and that sense of moving and being open to what the Spirit is calling us and leading us to do. We've so often, and I know I was guilty of it when I was leading congregations, of focusing on the thing that I wanted to, or the thing that I was interested in, and didn't spend the time in both listening and then responding to what the Spirit is saying and doing to us. So I really resonate with what you're talking about, that sense of movement in and with our community. If we can't be standing still. And this is that time where we are forming and reforming, and that by its very nature has movement to it. And I think we need to look for that movement and where the Spirit's already at work, and to join into those moments and those places.
Absolutely. And if I could just add one thing, movement, amen to that. I think also this question of how can a church be multiple generations?
Yes.
Sometimes I'm in a church and everyone in the church is a certain generation, which is wonderful. But how can churches be multi-generational? And so perhaps in a former time, there was a children's Sunday school class and a youth group and a young adult group and different ages. And some churches have gaps. And that's a sign of how do we pay attention. So one way some churches have responded to that is if the children are not in their church, they go out externally focused and they tutor the children in the local schools. Yeah. They send youth to camp in the summer. There are ways to build relationships across generations. That's a real sign of health. And I've had young adults say to me they want relationships with older adults. Right. But a healthy church is a multi-generational church.
Yeah, for sure. We've got a couple of our church plants that are intentionally experimenting with that kind of model, both in worship and as they're serving out in the community. They're very intentional about doing it together. And part of the ethos that they're creating is that shared learning, that each generation has something to both teach and learn, and it goes both ways. And part of that culture for churches with that multi mindset is, am I open? And again, the Spirit's going to continue to move in and around those spaces and places. So very cool. So as we think about vital and healthy congregations, we both talked about, I think, shifting our focus from programmatic ministry to this idea of focusing on mission and discipleship and everything as a function of discipleship, whether we're moving into worship or leadership development. We keep coming back to how do we grow to be a little bit more like Jesus with every moment. As we look at the vision and the impact for us as we move forward as the United Methodist Church, what do you think some of that might look like? You mentioned churches going out and being in the community. What are some other specific ways that we can encourage our current United Methodist churches as they seek to form and reform? What's that going to look like instead of being program focused to be more mission and discipleship focused?
Right. I think the programming was an era, I lived in part of it, where people were searching for programs. Right. And we were very good at designing programs. And we hoped that this met a need, and increasingly it did not meet a need. People were not searching for a program. Right. They're really searching for a way of life. And so mission and discipleship, for me, it goes back to our Methodist roots of works of mercy, works of piety. Yeah. Where a group would sit around in a circle and say, how have you been in mission this week? What's your prayer life been this week? And not a judgmental thing, but then they would help each other to do those things. And so if they were coaching each other in our language today, it'd be, a great coach doesn't say to someone, you need to do this. They show them how to do it. Yeah. And so getting back to the image of the physical body, it's learning how to do yoga, learning how to do a physical practice, stretching or something like that. And I think that's really, what is needed. You do hear about, biblical illiteracy, and most of us have overinvested in our work. We've overinvested in things. And to learn again basic spiritual practices of prayer, reading scripture, finding a way to serve in our community, finding a way to make a difference, finding a way to be generous. Those are basic practices. They really are prayer, Bible study,
Sure.
mission, stewardship. So we could use traditional categories, but we've almost got to relearn those practices, and we've got to walk with people so that they can experience them in the way they can experience them, not the way we want them to experience them. And that may come from a mindset that was again, back in time, is no longer relevant. I think we're just all going to need to do that. And so that's really very exciting to me. It is, Methodism really didn't start because of a controversy about what we believe. It started because we needed to live our faith.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's not that we can't or we don't want to stop doing programming. It's just looking at it through a new lens and through our old lens and through our historical roots of the class meetings and bands, of being focused on as we gather, what's God doing in our midst. I was with some planters yesterday. We were doing some equipping, and our unintentional theme became around what do we need to be doing with our leaders to be sure that we're both modeling and learning what it means to be disciples. So how as pastors are we being discipled, and how are we intentionally practicing what it means to help people learn to be like Jesus? And we have to be humble enough along the way that all the folks that we're with need to be teaching us too, because we have to keep learning that. And it came down to just a desire for their takeaways were around the desire to be intentional about that debrief time, about, after we've had some kind of programming or leadership meeting or a missional experience or even worship, to take the few minutes to say, what just happened? Where did we see God, and what was God doing in us and to us, and what has God called us next? Just taking a few minutes to take those steps and to add those into it, so it's not just a program to make sure we had the right amount of mustard laid out and put out in the right order, but what was God actually doing in the midst of that? And be sure that's what our focus and our energy is around. We can't function without the programs. I mean, you've taught me about, the need for institutions, and it's not something that drags us down. It's something that helps us live into who we are and what God's calling us to do and to be. And as leaders, I guess part of our responsibility is to be sure we keep asking that question: what's Jesus doing in us right now, and how can we be different? So as we get into more specifics of how we live out what it means to be United Methodists in our communities, how can we help churches actually connect with those people in their communities who aren't attending church? I mean, we hear often people aren't coming to church anymore, so instead of expecting them to come to us, what are you suggesting to folks to be proactively doing to kind of flip that narrative around so that we are going out into the community? What does it look like to connect with those folks, particularly ones who really don't want anything to do with church, or at least it feels that way sometimes?
Yeah. It's a great question. First, I think we need to have a bias for extroversion. Yeah. So if this question means anything, it needs, on a continuum, it needs to be more toward extroversion, less toward introversion. Yeah. So that, for me, the best way I have seen this actually happen has been through the Fresh Expressions movement, where we begin to try to see where are the people gathering in our community, not where do we wish they were gathering. We wish they were gathering in our parlor or in our gym or in our sanctuary. Right. But where are they actually gathering? On a soccer field, in a dog park, in a pub, in a coffee shop, in a rest diner? Where are they actually gathering? And then how can we be a presence there? How can we listen? How can we get to know them? How can we tell those stories? And you and I have both been part of this movement, and Luke Edwards has given great leadership for this in our conference. And so in most communities, there is a place people gather that for many is less threatening than crossing the threshold of a church door that they've never been inside. And that's the way I think it actually happens in our conference. The first Fresh Expression I ever saw was at the Nanahala Outdoor Center, River of Life, with Wayner Dickert. And that was people who gathered to go kayaking and canoeing. And they began a service on Sunday morning. And it was oriented around their lifestyle, not the church lifestyle of 11 a.m. inside a building. And so that's one of the great ways. I think mapping assets, this is a part of it. I just would want to caution us not to map the assets and not to take the action step of being present where those places are.
Yeah, I think, and as we look at this transition for our current, churches, Michael Beck, calls them inherited churches, our existing United Methodist communities. I think one of our struggles sometimes is making that transition to that outward focused and outward centered mindset. And I think part of the mission of the church for us to figure out here is how do we, do those things in concert together. Michael talks about the blended ecology and that mindset of helping our existing churches, kind of relook at the expectations as they are in ministry and in mission with the community. And I know one of the things I often get as we do work in churches is, we've done all these things out in the community and we've served all these people and none of them show up on Sunday morning. And, I think sometimes we get caught up in that metric of attendance of wanting people to come and be with us. And sometimes I wonder, what if we instead begin to measure how well we're attending to our communities and kind of flip that around. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be part of that extroversion movement and how Fresh Expressions can really help us make that transition together, because it's not one or the other. It's not Fresh Expressions at the expense of the church. It is being in concert and being in the body of Christ today and discovering different ways to be the church. And instead of expecting people to come to church, we need to continue to figure out what it means to be the church out in our communities.
We do need new metrics. I was remembering, I grew up in a deep South town, and our church was on a road called Double Churches Road. There were two churches together, and the other one, we never knew the people there really. The other one was, my grandmother told me one time, was what was called a hard shell church, and they only met every other Sunday. I always thought as a kid, wouldn't it be wonderful to be in a church that only met every other Sunday? I was into sports. That was my whole mindset. But she said they only meet every other Sunday, and they don't believe in missionaries because they think missionaries would just bring in the wrong people. Yeah. And so they were a very small church with a hard shell. And that's what we want to try to move away from in our own churches, to have a church that has a hard shell. We're pretty much the same people. We're all together. And that's been a part of the real, I would say, tragedy of our conversation about inclusion, that in some churches that have had this conversation, they are not near anyone they're thinking about or speaking about. You can be in a room with a small group of people. They see it as a cultural issue. Mm-hmm. And so how can we move out of our churches? And many people do this really well. Many people have taught me this, laity, and kind of get to know them as people and share life with them and authentically share our faith with them and learn about theirs.
Yeah. Well, you and I have been gifted with the joy of being a part of the connection, and to be sure that the connection at its best is at the heart of what it means, at the heart of what it means to be living out as United Methodists. How can churches tap into this thing that we call the connection, and what role will we continue to have as a connection? That as both at the conference level and district level and the local church missional network level. What do you think or maybe what are some of the examples that you've seen of the connection really at its best? And
I'm going to begin. Thanks, Rob. I'm going to begin taking the longer view. I was a pastor in this conference for 28 years, and there were 3 connectional experiences that I often felt were profoundly instrumental in making us better disciples. One was the walk to Emmaus and the resources of the upper room, the daily upper room devotional, the 5-day academies, the walk to Emmaus. I knew a number of the people. A man named Danny Morris was a close friend. He helped to begin the walk to Emmaus. Those retreats where people really went deeper in their spiritual life. The upper room was made possible by the connection. Second was disciple Bible study. And, more than 1 million people went through disciple, read all of the Bible in a year, talked about questions like, how is this helping me to be a disciple? I taught disciple a number of times, team taught it with a layperson, had got to know people on a deep level, saw people be very vulnerable with their real lives, what was going on and how that related to faith. And again, that came through our publishing house, The Connection. And then the third were mission teams. And, we were very involved in mission in Guatemala when I was at Mount Tabor, in Haiti when I was at Providence. And those mission teams where mostly laity went to serve and found that they themselves were the ones who were changed. Right. And I know 2 women who went on mission teams, and since they have returned, they often go to immigration court each week in their city and monitor the people whose cases are being heard, because they were the kinds of people they met on mission teams. So they've brought that back to where they live. And so those are just examples. Now, those are basic things: prayer, retreat, Bible study, mission, made possible by the connection. I would say more in a very different way, the connection is important for areas like supervision of clergy, and when there is malpractice, and when there's abuse, and for the protection of the flock. Or when there is misspending of financial resources in a local church. That's the connection too, how the connection comes alongside a local church and helps it not to do harm to itself. That's a little more sobering, but that's the connection too. And that's deeply rooted in how we watch over one another in love.
Right. I think one of the ways that you've helped my office with church development to kind of refocus ourselves, and it's connected back to the, programming versus, mission and movement, discipleship kind of focus is, we're working on shifting, really to resourcing in the ways that you were talking about, to resource clergy and laity to engage in, whether it's Bible study, mission, disciple-centered leadership, and how do we orient ourselves to be a church that's a spiritual movement. You get that from Sue Nelson Kibbe and her work around what does it look like to lead people who are on a spiritual movement, as opposed to just trying to organize ourselves together. And so we're trying, from a connectional point of view, we're trying to align our resources and the equipping that we do and the connecting of people around that are doing things in different places, so we can all learn together. And what it looks like to keep coming back again to that basic discipleship question. I do continue to wonder what it would look like if we simply add that little phrase on the end of most everything we do as we look at leadership development as a way of discipleship. You introduced that to me when you were focusing us on anti-racism as discipleship, not just as a social movement, but a way for us to grow in our lives of faith. What does it look like if we're looking through the lens of worship? This is a way that we get to grow to be more like Jesus, and which is going to inform who we are as we spill out into the world. And every interaction has the potential to be a moment of discipleship where we could either ask in our head or debrief with other people, what did God just do right here? Because those are the exciting things. Those are the things, that's what I want to be a part of. That's the thing that stirs passion in my soul, the flame that you talked about, that at the root of who we are as United Methodists. There is movement inside of us. And I think the connection, when we're at our best, is when we're equipping and resourcing the folks within our realm to do exactly that, and to be more and more like Jesus in our communities around us. That's what's going to change the world.
Right.
At annual conference, we got to introduce and commissioned 17 emerging community pastors to our conference. And so I get this question almost weekly. So what exactly is an emerging community? And as you and I, we actually get to meet face-to-face with these folks next week for a couple of days. We're going to go even deeper into that. Just how are you answering? I'm curious about how you're answering that question, because I know you get it too. How are you defining what these emerging communities are?
Well, and this was a response to disaffiliation across our conference, which is a minority of our churches, but a significant group of churches who were important to us. And we have been through a long process of separation and formal disaffiliation by the majority of them. It's the minority of our total number of churches. But so we began to see, you were instrumental in this, Rob, that there were particular areas that seemed not to have a great United Methodist influence after this happened. And there were laity who we all encountered. I encountered many of these laypersons when I was visiting the 8 districts last winter and spring, who said, my church has left, but I want to be United Methodist. They were in grief. Mm-hmm. They had lost their church, lost the building where many important things had happened. And we did not want to abandon these areas. Simultaneously, the Duke Endowment, which is an extraordinary gift to rural communities in North Carolina, and part of that is the Methodist Church, because of Mr. Duke's will, gave us a grant to do this work. And so the fruit of that grant is in large part the work of these 17 persons who really are circuit riders, missionaries, right, establishing new networks, new communities. We're not asking them to replicate the buildings we had. We're asking them to form new communities. There'll be faithful United Methodist communities, generously Orthodox Christian communities, inclusive communities. Mm-hmm. They don't need to replicate the churches that are already in these communities.
Right.
They are a fresh wind of the Spirit, and so that's really the purpose. Our ongoing work with them is to support them, to resource them, remind them they're not alone, reassure them. And so that's the work we're in. We're very early in it, but we believe it will change the ecosystem of our annual conference. They were commissioned at annual conference in a full Stewart auditorium, and it's a great group of people, and their work is just inspiring. It's really, a lot of it is one-on-one discipleship and forming relationships.
Yeah, there's some really cool energy that's coming out, and it's already some neat stories of how people are being connected, and fresh expressions. There's a term of people of peace, mm-hmm, who may or may not join in that work, but they are connectors to people who they know are looking for something and something different. And I know at the heart of our grant request was this opportunity to not just try to get through these next couple of years and survive, but actually to use it as an opportunity to both do some experiment and some assessment of who we are and what it looks like to be United Methodist, and to try some things that we probably never would have, without these resources and without this opportunity. So there's a lot of cool experiments that are out there that, and I'll use your words, we want to do some planting work, but not in the way that we've been doing it in the past. Yeah. And there are times where we're still can do what I would say some conventional type of planting, but even that is shifting and changing. And this is going to give us an opportunity to experiment how to do that even more faithfully as we move into the future. And I just ask folks to continue to lift these these emerging community pastors up in their hearts and their prayers. It's out on the frontier, and there's two kind of prevailing questions or things around this that's helping us frame that. One is just the big picture question, instead of looking at like an individual outpost or charge or church, but to look at a region or an area and just wonder, we come back to what we started with, a healthy, vital United Methodist presence look like in this area, in this time, and in this space, and which may look different than our conventional churches from the past. And then the other phrase that you've already mentioned is just to experiment. What does a modern day circuit rider look like? I'm really fascinated by that aspect of it too, and to learn from these folks of what it's like to be out there and pounding the streets and driving the back roads and meeting with people who really not sure they even want to walk back inside of a church, but are still longing for what we know Jesus is offering to us every day. So it's so exciting. I'm so glad to be a part of that work and getting to do that with you. As we close up our time together, there any other big picture resources that might be ahead of us that can inspire our current churches to make some of these shifts to this new view of this emerging view of what it means to be a United Methodist?
Yeah. Well, I would want to say that we've talked about the emerging communities, and I had a conversation with a colleague earlier this morning. Grateful for that. I also want listeners to know that we've invested significant time last year and this year with what we call first churches. Mm-hmm. They're not like elitist churches, but they are often the churches in the center of a town or a community. Pilot Mountain, Moxville, Newton, Morganton, Lenoir, Lexington, etc. And they have, these churches have challenges, they have gifts, and they have a strategic place and role in a community. They have a lot of heritage. Their future sometimes looks uncertain because a lot of these are in the midst of change. These communities are. So we have ongoing cohorts of clergy, staff, and laity in those churches. So that's an example of the ecosystem. We've invested in what we call our anchor Black churches in our largest cities in terms of strengthening financially their leadership. This year, we hope to add an associate pastor in one of these churches. Mm-hmm. And so I want listeners to know that when we think about the church, they are a variety of kinds of churches. Right. And that is a healthy ecosystem for the conference. Every church does not look alike. What they look like is based on where they're located. And so I think resourcing these churches from the conference's point of view is how to help them be stronger, more connected, more missional, more vital, more aware of our identity at annual conference. That was about grace, connection, holiness. Yes. This is who we are. Grace of Jesus Christ, our connection to each other on a path to holiness. And I think beyond that, I trust shared leadership when I see it. And that is when clergy and laity come together and struggle and discern and take action on a way forward for their church. I love to see shared leadership. The strongest clergy leaders love shared leadership. Right. And the laity respect the clergy empower the laity. They do it together. No one's on a pedestal. And that's getting back to health. But part of the reason clergy are so exhausted in some places is they felt like they were doing all of the leadership. And that's not universally true, but how we move toward that. So the resourcing needs to be for both. And the last thing I would say is a lot of that resourcing is going to be just exactly the way we're having this conversation right now. Mm-hmm. That COVID accelerated our movement into the hybrid world. Right. Monday evening, we're talking on a Wednesday morning. Monday evening, I met with 75 laity from our annual conference in their lay servant ministry training with our lay leader, John Crane. They were from all over the conference, the mountains, metro area, Triad. And that's just a great way to resource people. And so I think our leaning into learning in a digital space and how we do that is one of the ways we can also be connected. And then when we are physically together, we have that shared experience. Is both and. So I see that as coming toward us in the future too. Yeah.
I think my team would not be happy if I didn't do a plug for Transformation Journey, because at its heart is exactly what you described. It's not a program. It is a framework of leadership discernment for local churches. Example, one of ours right now is Gethsemane and Greensboro, and they came to us a year and a half ago and said, our community is completely changing. We're about to become a suburb of Greensboro. We're a rural church out, on corner 150 and Church Street, separated from Greensboro, but suddenly everything around us is changing. We don't know how to be the church. Can you help us do that? And so Transformation Journey at its heart comes together with the lay and the pastor of these churches. And we start asking these kind of questions about what does that look like. And then we come alongside with guides, and the vast majority of our guides are leaders within our conference, both lay and clergy who have maybe walked that path before and come together, and we continue to refine that. And now it's a team of folks that are coming together with those churches and walking with them. The churches are still doing the work, and it's driven by those churches. We just come and as a resource and a collaborator with them and in conversation with them, try to help them walk through that and begin to make some of those changes. And I mentioned Gethsemane. They've been through some struggles with just in their leadership and with their identity of what's next. And they'll tell you because of Transformation Journey. And by the way, they did start with the discipleship piece for their leaders to what does it mean to be a leader that's a disciple. And they had pretty significant decisions that they had to make. And in that kind of after action thing, they said they made different decisions because of this process they had meant to you that had refocused them as leaders and has given them a completely different vision that is now just what you described. They are spilling out into their community and really being church in the community around them. And it's really, really cool. And so any church in the conference can go to the conference website and apply, and we'll be in conversation with you about that. So again, I think the more we're moving forward together and to discovering this movement of the Spirit, it's not just about clergy. It's not just about lay. It's us doing this together and in community and with the communities which we serve.
All right.
So
great.
Well, thank you, Bishop. This has been fun to talk about this. I'd love to sit and talk with you for another couple hours, but thank you for your time and your wisdom and for your leadership.
Thank you, Rob, and blessings to you also and all who are listening.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.